This is part 8 of the Creed 7B Mark 1 Teleprinter restoration series. I've got as far as restoring the base and several of the major components within the machine, and so I'm finally at the point where I can start to reassemble it. So it's a bare chassis. In the last video I showed that I'd completely repainted this. I've given it a very good inspection and it all seems fine. There are no cracks or pits or anything that needs repairing, so I can finally start putting bits back onto it. The first part I shall refit is the nameplate. These are actually quite interesting. What Creed did is they included on the nameplate a customer marking, and you can actually look up these codes and see who the machine originally went to and how it was configured. There were quite a few wiring options and configuration options for these machines, and it's quite interesting to see what they were ordered for, and then you can get a good idea as to what they were going to be used for. So as I say, I'll fit this first and then I'll flip the chassis over and we can start refitting the wiring loom. Okay, so this is held in place with 4 small rivet pins, so they just go through the hole in the plate and then they're driven into the small holes in the chassis. So the next thing I'll do is we'll turn over the chassis and start reinstalling the wiring loom. Before I fit the wiring loom, I'm just going to replace the run switch actuator arms and levers, simply because it's easier to do that now than it will be when the switch is in the way. So I've already lubricated these and it's just a case of dropping them into place and then refitting the end plate and pivots. So just make sure it moves freely. Any of the holes that are in the chassis that carry moving parts I did mask off or block when I painted the chassis, just to make sure that I didn't accidentally fill them with paint. But even so, I'm still making sure that they are still free running and I'm not going to encounter any problems. This is really a case of making sure I fit it the reverse way that I removed it and everything lines up. So we have the switch plunger that's operated by the start-stop weight. We have the rocker lever. As I say, I have lubricated the pivot points, so that goes through the actuator hole into its bearing, and then there's a bearing plate that sits on the outer end, and then the rocker lever pivots between those 2 points and it actuates the switch that sits here. I'll just try and get it all lined up. Okay, so that's the rocker fitted, and it obviously should move freely and not bind up, which it does, and there shouldn't be too much end float, so that looks fine. I can now get the wiring loom, drop that into place and try and get it all attached, and then I can reconnect the control cables. Okay, so I have the wiring loom. I don't think there's any real tricks in doing this. I think it's just a case of wiggling everything about until it gets into the right location. So that's the motor mount refitted, the motor connector and the keyboard connector bolted back in place. I'll now flip the chassis over and we can complete installing the wiring loom. Okay, so this capacitor mounts up here, but I'll leave that disconnected for now because I'll need to replace this wire. This is part of the mains wire and I cut off when I took the mains cable out, and I need to get underneath this, so I won't bolt this in until I've done that. Down to the other end I'll now refit the run switch and the solenoid connector. Okay, before I bolt this in permanently I need to refit the over center spring. So if you're not familiar with these are part of a switch mechanism that causes the switch to change position rapidly rather than just slowly changing and causing possible slow contact or noisy contact problems. They are a bit of a pain to fit, but I'll see if I can get it in to the position it's supposed to be in. Okay, so that's the wiring loom mostly refitted. I've got a few bits left to finish off. The run switch is working fine. The override is working fine, so I had to adjust the rocker, but it's now working as it should. I've been checking the wiring as I've been going and making sure that it's wired up as it should be. There were various options for wiring this, but this is the basic wiring. I do have a terminal for this machine, which we'll look at in a future video once we get closer to actually running it. But I've been making sure that it's wired up as it should be. There are two options here. There's a 12 connector option and a 9 connector, and this is the one that I have. These are obviously all the terminal blocks, and as I say, I've been making sure that this is how it's actually wired up so that it hasn't been modified or changed in any way that's going to stop it from working in the way that I intend to use it. Also, the motor wiring I will check once we get to refitting the motor. There was an issue I had with the governor. I'll look at that in the next video. But in the remainder of this video, what I'm going to do is just reattach the mains wire. I mentioned in an earlier video that the actual main wire itself seemed fine, and where it had dried up and started getting very brittle at the ends, I cut it back and the internal wiring is fine, so I can reuse that. And then I'll reattach the control wires. As you may recall, I colour coded these for easy identification, but I will check against the wiring diagram to make sure that they are actually correct. Before I fit the wires, one last task is to replace the bushes that fit in the access holes. The ones that were in there are made of Bakelite, and they just disintegrated when I took the wires out. So I have made a couple of replacements out of Delrin, obviously much more modern plastic, but it does look exactly as the originals did, and obviously the colour matches, so I'll get those fitted first. And then once I've done that, I'll reattach the wires and just quickly show that before I finish off this video. And then in the next video we can get to fitting the main blocks back to the machine and start to see how all the assemblies fit. Okay, so I finally have the wiring loom refitted. All the mechanical parts below the chassis are reinstalled. I've reconnected the external cables. That includes the signal cable and the power cable. I've cleaned up the connections, and I have been checking this wiring as I've been going through it, and perhaps not surprisingly, it's nothing like this. The basic wiring seems to be the same, but the detail as to what each particular wire goes to is completely different. So I have traced it through, and it does seem to still be the same circuit. It's just using completely different terminals to what it's showing on the diagram. There are a few extra components on here, and in the service manuals and bulletins there were various noise suppression modifications, some of which seem to be on this machine. they don't really make a huge difference. It's just this is switching highly inductive loads, so it makes creates a lot of interference, and they took various steps to try to minimize that. That's everything under here done for now. Obviously I'll have to come back and recheck this once I start applying power to it, but now I can flip the chassis over and start reinstalling the various hardware modules, and that's what I will do in the next video.